Hello and welcome to the Commander's Quarters, your Magic the Gathering source that helps you command your budget. This show and episodes like this one are possible thanks to viewers like you. If you're looking for an easy way to help support this show, make sure that you like, share, and subscribe. Also, hit that bell notification icon so you don't miss any new episodes. You can also go check out our playmats and other merchandise at thecommandersquarters.com. Another easy way to support this show is with our TCG player affiliate links. So whether you're buying a deck or individual cards, you can use this general link right here or one in the description. And the final way that you can support this show is by supporting us directly by becoming a patron. There are many benefits to being a patron, and I truly couldn't do this without all their support. Hey everyone, Mitch coming in for the Commander's Quarters studio. Welcome to the show. So, there are a ton of different mechanics throughout Magic's history, probably hundreds or so. I'm sorry, I didn't do the math. There's a lot of them out there, and for all the good ones that are out there, there are a lot of bad ones out there too. One might say they're pretty forgettable. But I'm here today to remind you of Magic's worst mechanics, so let's jump into it. Now, before we get started, I'm going to set a few ground rules for this episode. First off, this list of worst or forgettable mechanics is obviously going to be from my perspective. This list is of course subjective and everyone's got their own opinion. So the mechanic in my opinion might be bad or forgettable or a combination of both. And because I'm doing this from my perspective, I'm only going to be including mechanics that are from sets from when I started playing, which happened to be around the time of Odyssey and Onslaught. So my apologies to everyone who's looking for banding to be on this list, it's not on it. And the third thing, I think it'd be fun to make a game of this. So at first I'm going to hide the reminder text to see if you remember what the mechanic does as well. So let's use Moment's Peace, which has Flashback as an example, and again, this is just an example. Flashback, in my opinion, is a great mechanic. I've blocked out all the relevant text, so if you don't know what Flashback does, then you're not going to be able to read the card and find out. I'll give you a second to guess, although you could just pause the video as well if you really wanted to. And then I'll read the reminder text and talk about why this mechanic isn't good and or it's forgettable. Make sense? Good. Let's go. So first up, we've got a card from one of my earliest sets with Onslaught with Feral Throwback. And Feral Throwback is actually a twofer. It has two mechanics that made my list with both Amplify and Provoke. So first up, think about what Amplify is, or pause the video, and I'll reveal it now. So Feral Throwback has Amplify too, which means as this card comes into play, put 2+1/+1 counters on it for each beast card you reveal in your hand. So Amplify is a mechanic that can be found on creatures, and it's going to have a number next to it. For each creature revealed that shares a creature type with a card, it gets that many +1/+1 counters. Now, I don't think that Amplify is necessarily a bad mechanic. In fact, I think it's pretty unique. It's just kind of wonky. And aside from that, I personally didn't remember what it did, and I played with plenty of Amplify cards back when I was a kid. Now let's move on to the Provoke mechanic, so I'll give you a second. And revealing. Provoke says when this attacks, you may have target creature defending player controls, untap, and block if able. So it's not a bad mechanic in my opinion. It's a good way to give creatures some kind of a creature removal through combat. But it is pretty forgettable, especially that part about untapping. Without reminder text, it'd be pretty tough to remember that, and in my opinion, one of the hallmarks of a good mechanic is that you pretty much just always remember what it does without having to read reminder text. But now let's move on to another twofer, and I promise this one's going to be quicker, with Arcbound Wanderer. It has Modular and Sunburst, and the reminder text just happens to involve both mechanics, so we'll go through both at the same time. So think about what both those mechanics do, pause if you need to, and let's go. It says, this enters the battlefield with a +1/+1 counter on it for each color of mana spent to cast it. When it dies, you may put its +1/+1 counters on target artifact creature. So normally Modular has a number next to it, and in this case Sunburst is replacing it. So if it had Modular 1, it would come into play with one counter, and then you could distribute that counter to another target artifact creature when it dies. Whereas Sunburst deals with the number of colors of mana spent to cast something. And that can either involve the number of charge counters something comes into play with, or in this case, +1/+1 counters. In my opinion, both these mechanics are pretty hard to remember, especially when put together. Perhaps the biggest problem with Modular, in my opinion, is that artifact creature specificity. I understand the flavor of one machine breaking down and then the other machine kind of getting its parts and whatnot, but it's kind of hard to remember that it only can go on artifact creatures. And then Sunburst, let's just say it's not very inspiring to me. But now let's move on to a completely different one with Sweep, which we can see on Barrel Down Soken-Zan. To my knowledge, there aren't too many cards with Sweep out there, so this one might not be all that fair, but still, I'll give you a few seconds, and let's get into it. It says return any number of mountains you control to their owner's hands. Barrel Down Soken-Zan deals damage to target creature equal to twice the number of mountains returned this way. So essentially Sweep is return any number of a certain basic land depending on the color of the card back to your hand, and then it does something based on that number. Yeah, deramping yourself is usually not a very good idea for most decks, so I can see why it never really caught on. Regardless, pretty forgettable in my opinion. Staying with Kamigawa though, let's move on to Patron of the Moon, which has Moonfolk Offering. And to be more specific, I guess I'm just talking about offering, not necessarily just Moonfolk Offering. There are different kinds of offerings. You get what I mean. Anyways, I'll give you a moment to think about what offering is, and let's jump into it. So Offering says you may play this card anytime you could play an instant by sacrificing a Moonfolk and paying the difference in mana cost between this and the sacrificed Moonfolk. Mana cost includes color. So if this mechanic sounds somewhat familiar, you might be thinking of Emerge, which in my opinion is a slightly better version of this mechanic. First off, it takes off that creature requirement, so instead of it just being a Moonfolk, which there aren't a lot of Moonfolk tribal decks out there, yeah, so you can use any creature. And secondly, that flash part just seems kind of tacked on there, and that to me is probably the hardest thing to remember. You may remember that you have to sacrifice a Moonfolk, and then it helps reduce the cost of this card, but you probably don't remember that it has flash. Or maybe you do because you've got a Patron of the Moon Moonfolk tribal deck, and congratulations. Next up, let's move on to a pair of mechanics with Bolster and Support, which I always forget which one does which, so I want to see if you do too. So first off, let's look at Dromoka's Gift, which has Bolster, and here we go. Bolster 4 says, choose a creature with the least toughness among creatures you control and put 4+1/+1 counters on it. And so then Support, which is on lead by example, is of course, put a ++1 counter on each of up to 2 target creatures. Again, personally, I can never really remember which one does which, and maybe that's just a name thing. Helping out a small creature could really use the word Bolster, or could actually use Support as well. And the specific on Bolster that trips me up as well is Toughness. It's not least toughness or power, which I think would be a little easier to remember. And then Support 2 means that you get 1 counter on 2 creatures, but sometimes I might think that, oh, if I only have 1 creature in play, I can put both counters on 1, and you can't do that. So both have their flaws and are hard to remember, in my opinion. And now let's move on to another doubleheader with Delirium and Spell Mastery, 2 mechanics that I really have problems with. So let's identify these 2 first, and then we'll talk about my problems. Well, with the cards, not my problems in general. Anyways, Delirium first, so think about it, pause if you need to, and here we go. To the Slaughter says, target player sacrifices a creature or planeswalker, and its Delirium says, if there are 4 or more card types among cards in your graveyard, instead that player sacrifices a creature and a planeswalker. And now let's move on to Send to Sleep, which has Spell Mastery, and think about what Spell Mastery is. Okay, here we go. Send to Sleep says, tap up to 2 target creatures, Spell Mastery. If there are 2 or more instant and or sorcery cards in your graveyard, those creatures don't untap during their controller's next untap steps. So both of these involve counting a certain number of types of cards in your graveyard, and basically the card is better if you have that requirement. Now these sound like a mechanic that I enjoyed from my childhood with Threshold, and Threshold did not make this list. With Threshold, the requirement is having 7 or more cards in your graveyard. To me, that's really easy to remember and really easy to check. You start the game off with 7 cards in your hand, now 7 cards in your graveyard also means something. And they can be any kind of card in your graveyard, as long as you've got 7 or more, you've got Threshold. For Delirium, counting 4 more card types is not as easy. You gotta look for your creature, okay, this is a creature, okay, wait, no, this is another creature, okay, this one's a land, okay, now I got an instant too, okay, do I have a sorcery? No, I don't have a sorcery, okay, I don't have Delirium. Or maybe you've got an enchantment that's also a creature, like one of the gods. Does that count as both? It does. And then Spell Mastery might be cleaner than Delirium, but in my opinion, it's nowhere near as clear as Threshold. You still have to look into your graveyard to see if you have specific card types. Yes, it's a lot more simple just being instants and or sorceries, but yeah. And why is it 2? Both of these, hard to remember in my opinion. Wizards, just stick with Threshold, it's awesome. There, solved. You're welcome. Moving on though, next up an extremely forgettable mechanic from Cold Snap with Recover. So think about what Recover is, pause if needed, and here we go. Resize has Recover 1 and a green, and it says, whenever a creature is put into your graveyard from play, you may pay 1 green. If you do, return this card from your graveyard to your hand, otherwise remove this card from the game. This is a mechanic that you're gonna forget about, and you're gonna make a mistake. Once a card with Recover goes into your graveyard, you have to forever remember that until one of your creatures dies. And that might be 5 turns later, so I guarantee there might be missed triggers with this card. So if you didn't remember to pay that Recover cost, it's exiled. And then maybe a couple turns later, you're looking through your graveyard and you can't remember when exactly this went in and then when a creature died, so was it exiled or was it not supposed to be exiled? Yeah, so Recover a very forgettable mechanic overall and in-game. But now let's recover from Recover and move on to Reinforce. And of course, Reinforce can be seen on the Commander staple Mosquito Guard. Just kidding, not a Commander staple. Anyways, think about it, pause if you need to, and let's go. Mosquito Guard has Reinforce 1 for 1 and a white, which says, pay 1 and a white, discard this card, put a +1 counter on target creature. I don't necessarily think it's a bad mechanic concept, I just really don't remember what Reinforce does. It's kind of like Blood Rush, but Blood Rush was more recent, so maybe that's why I remember that one. I don't know. And speaking of blood, next is Bloodthirst with Furyborn Hellkite. So think about what Bloodthirst is, and here we go. Furyborn Hellkite has Bloodthirst 6, which means if an opponent was dealt damage this turn, this creature enters the battlefield with 6 +1/+1 counters on it. So to me, this one's kind of hard to remember, especially the fact that it's just damage dealt and not life loss. It's a fun mechanic, I just think that distinction's a bit too specific for everyone to remember it. I'm not sure exactly why that distinction was made, maybe it's because it shows up mostly on green and red creatures, which are combat-based, but there are some black creatures that have it as well, and in black there are drain effects. So again, it can be a fun mechanic, but again, pretty forgettable in my opinion. And speaking of forgettable, next up is Forecast, which comes on Skyscribing. So dig deep into your thoughts and think about what Forecast is, and let's go. So Skyscribing has Forecast, 2 and a blue, reveal Skyscribing from your hand, each player draws a card, activates ability only during your upkeep and only once each turn. So that's a lot of requirements. So revealing the card from your hand, I completely understand that. You're forecasting it, you're showing the other player that I have this, and eventually I'm going to cast it, but probably not because that is forecast, so I'm just going to keep doing this over and over again. But wait, I can't do this over and over again, I can only do this during my upkeep and only once each turn. And the problem there is probably that during my upkeep part, because, yeah, people forget things about their upkeep all the time, especially when that card is in your hand and not on the battlefield to remind you. So again, forgettable because of that specific timing and only being able to do it once, even though it's still in your hand. Yeah. And just so I'm covering my bases, other forecast cards do other things, but they all have those same requirements. Anyways, back to Kamigawa with Soul Shift. So reach deep into your soul and think about what Soul Shift does or whatnot. Anyways, let's go. Kami of Empty Graves has Soul Shift 3. When this is put into a graveyard from play, you may return target spirit card with converted mana cost 3 or less from your graveyard to your hand. So this one's bad in my opinion just because it's so specific to just spirits. I understand that it came from Kamigawa, which has a heavily influenced spirit block, but a very, very, very specific mechanic just for one creature? Come on. I mean, there's even a human that has Soul Shift that can only get you back a spirit. And I can even see how people might get tripped up on the number next to it, thinking it might be the number of spirits versus the converted mana cost, but yeah. Let's just move on from that to Conspire. So think to yourself what Conspire does, and let's go. So, Ghastly Discovery has Conspire. As you play this spell, you may tap 2 untapped creatures you control that share a color with it. When you do, copy it. First off, you've got to remember that it's 2 creatures. And if you remember Spell Mastery, you know I hate the number 2. All jokes aside, though, I think the part that I get tripped up on this one is having those creatures share a color with it. That's something that I would easily forget, having the wrong colors of creatures in play, then casting a spell that has Conspire, and then I can't Conspire it, and then I didn't mean to cast a spell, and yeah, this can cause some problems. That might just be me, though, and maybe you wouldn't make that same mistake. And now we finally got into the last mechanic that made my list today with Haunt. And Haunt very well might be in the running for the worst mechanic of all time. So take a second, think about what Haunt is, and let's go. So Orzhov Euthanist has Haunt. When this card is put into a graveyard from play, remove it from the game, haunting target creature. When Orzhov Euthanist comes into play, or the creature it haunts is put into a graveyard, destroy target creature that was dealt damage this turn. Huh? Did you follow that? Because I didn't. So let's break it down. Basically, this has an ETB when it comes into play. It destroys a creature that was dealt damage this turn. That's easy enough to understand. But when this creature dies, you exile it, and then you pick another creature on the board, and then it's haunting that creature. And then when that creature dies, you can destroy another target creature that was dealt damage this turn. That is far too much for anyone to remember ever. So now you've got to track a secondary creature and know that when that creature dies, what specifically is going to happen. No thank you. So this is an extremely forgettable mechanic, again, in-game and out-of-game. So yeah, Haunt is definitely on my short list for worst mechanic of all time. And with that, this show is coming to a close, so it's my turn to hear from you. So in the comments below, let me know what mechanic I didn't mention today that you think should have made this list. So yeah, let me know in the comments below, and as always, thanks again, and have a good one.